How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're listening to DNA Today, a podcast and radio show where we discover new advances in the world of genetics. From genetic technology like CRISPR to rare diseases to new research, we have you covered. For a decade, DNA Today has brought you the voices of leaders in genetics. I'm Keira Deneen. I'm a certified genetic counselor and your host. Are you interested in the rapidly growing field of genetics and want to learn more about clinical genetics, molecular genetics, and laboratory science? Then you should check out the Genetic Assistant Online Training Program at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. By taking part in the program, you will be joining both national and international learners with the same passion for genetics. Interact directly with your Johns Hopkins instructors and fellow learners throughout the program. Applications are open now for the spring cohort, which starts on January 23rd, 2023. For more information, use the link in our show notes if you're listening to this through a podcast app. You can also access the link at dnatoday.com. My guest today is Sage Sargent, who is a patient advocate for Congenital Adrenal Hyperplasia, which we're probably going to refer to as CAH throughout the episode. Sage has a bachelor's degree in gender studies from the University of Utah, which is going to be really useful in our conversation today because we're talking about people like Sage, and Sage is going to, share her experience with CAH and being non-binary. So thank you so much, Sage, for coming on the show. I'm excited to have a different kind of episode.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm an open book. I'm ready to answer some questions.
That's exactly how I start interviews when I'm the guest. I'm like, ask me anything. This is like an AMA. So,
yeah.
For those that don't know that are listening, what is CAH? What does it stand for again? Just to, if people were kind of zoned out when I said it, and how does it affect the body?
So I want to just start by saying I do have more of a layman's understanding and not a medical understanding, but even though I live with it, CAH stands for Congenital Adrenal Hyperplasia. And some of the things that pretty much my understanding of it is that through a long enzyme chain of different things, starting with cholesterol all the way down to cortisol, pretty much, my body is missing a piece that doesn't allow me to produce cortisol through my adrenal glands, which are on top of the kidneys. And because of that, there can be a slew of issues.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as you were highlighting there, it comes down to hormone imbalance compared to someone that doesn't have CAH, and looking at how that process, as you said, it's like kind of a long biochemical pathway that honestly sometimes I still get confused by, because this is a more complex disorder than I think a lot of other genetic conditions that we compare it to. And one of the aspects of it is that there are different types, just like a lot of other genetic conditions. Can you describe what those two main types are? There's one main symptom difference between the two types, and maybe share what type you have.
Yeah, for sure. So the two main types are classic and non-classic. So classic CAH has the main symptom difference that you're talking about. Classic CAH has a salt wasting symptom. And my best understanding of that is it has to do literally just like electrolytes, potassium and sodium, and the body doesn't do well at holding on to those. Why? I couldn't tell you. And then the non-classic it sticks strictly to the, just the cortisol issue.
And people with CAH, including yourself, can also have differences in genitals and the development of that. Do you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about your own personal experience and how this started? I think when you're about 6 months old is when your family started, not you. You weren't really processing things at the time at 6 months, but can you share what that process was for your parents in terms of the diagnostic odyssey there?
Yeah. So Like you said, I obviously wasn't really processing it at that time at 6 months old, but so I was assigned female at birth. They didn't see any issues, and at this time they didn't, test for CAH right off the bat. So, they wrap me up, send me home. Here's your cute little girl. Have a nice life. And at around 6 months, um, I apparently had like a UTI or something to that effect. I was, you know, in a lot of discomfort while I was peeing. And so my mom just took me to the pediatrician, just, planning antibiotic or whatever. And then they told her pretty much, you need to get this baby to primary children's immediately. I live in Utah, but you need to get this child to the hospital immediately. And basically, before you know it, I was in like an emergency 8-hour surgery because like a membrane had started to grow over the outside of my urethra, and on the inside, my urethra was starting to not be shaped correctly, due to some of these, it's just the virilization that can happen. But mine, unlike what happens in most classic CAH, mine happened after birth. A lot of classic CAH patients it happens in the womb, so they are born with, why am I having a difficult time? They can't quite tell with the genitals. So that wasn't my case, but I do know that a lot of folks with classic CAH, that's what they experience. Well, a lot of girls, from my understanding. But yeah, no, mine was, a little late, and it was mainly because it was a health concern and not a, how do you say, a social, sexual social concern, as some are.
Yeah, you bring up a good point in terms of there's medical aspect of this condition, certainly in terms of, as you brought up, with salt wasting and that being, in some cases, life-threatening. So that certainly is a symptom that we need to stay on top of if we have this disorder, or for caregivers, parents. And that's one that I have patients that will ask me a lot about, because this condition can come up in the prenatal setting, as you mentioned. And one part that is probably changed, we're the same age, so in the last 27 years, I think conversations have changed a lot in terms of performing, genital correcting, or, using different terms like that, really aren't necessarily appropriate, and making those decisions. I mean, for you, it was a little bit different because there was nothing at birth. As you said, you were assigned female at birth. Nothing was coming up at that point. First 6 months of your life, you were just, healthy, normal baby with no issues. Certainly talking to other people in the CAH community, have you heard of them and their parents, caregivers, having a conversation with their doctors about surgery and whether to do that, when to do that? Because, certainly it's a very hard decision that has so many different layers to it. It's not necessarily just that medical aspect that you mentioned. It's also, there's the gender aspect, the sex aspect. What have you heard from people in your community?
This is where the hotbed of, is when it comes to CAH and some other intersex conditions. One, because then we start talking about this idea of age of consent, and what that looks like. And I'm going to be right up front about it. I don't think there is a 100% correct answer for anything, because not everyone's experience is 100% the same. I do think it is important, though, that rather than reaching for quick answers and quick solutions to, things that scare us, because it's okay. My parents admit they were terrified. They just did what the doctor said because they didn't know what was going on. That we, more as a, within the medical profession, as a society as a whole, the LGBT community, whatever, we start looking more at like, what is that fear, and backing off from these reactive things that stay with people for a lifetime. Because although I haven't ever, one-on-one had these conversations, I have seen, various stories, blogs, videos of what and whatnot of other intersex folks talking about some really horrendous things that happened to them as children that they, of course, had no say in because they were children, that are still affecting them to this day. And one of the biggest things we hear is that, well, we don't want them to get bullied. And if that's our biggest concern, then maybe we should worry more about why children or adults or anyone else is, bullying someone because they're different. That's more the concern than this person's body. If it's healthy, it's not harmful, everything's fine. Like, and I think also the fact that it occurs within the genitals is the biggest reason it becomes so taboo. One, it centers a lot around heteronormative sex, in regards to, is it going to be a boy or a girl, in regards to, is it long enough for, literally, is it big enough for heteronormative sex? How should we function all this? And, it's very reactive, fear-based, and closed-minded. And I'm not saying that people who choose to do that aren't doing that because they're doing it because they love their children and they want to do what's best. I'm not sitting here trying to tell people what to do. I'm not a parent, but I do think we can do better. I just think we can do better. So that's all.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's very well said, that if there's no medical intervention that needs to happen, that it seems like it would be a better setup to have that child be part of the conversation at age of consent, if that can be a choice that's delayed, so that that person can be involved in their own medical decision making, and being able to go through some of puberty so that that person can figure out what their gender identity is. And I think you brought up a really good point too, that a lot of people are learning that gender is a spectrum, but also that sex is a spectrum. I don't hear that conversation as much, and I think that's important, as you're bringing up, that there is, intersex is a type of sex. And so we really do have a spectrum there. And as a prenatal genetic counselor, I'm the person that's often telling people if we're predicting for this pregnancy to end up being a male baby or a female baby. And it is really hard and frustrating on my end when I do have patients say, oh, we want to know the gender, we're doing a gender reveal. And certainly learning more information about your pregnancy is a very exciting time. And I want to validate people that are going through that. And, we learn everything is healthy in some cases, and say, okay, now we get to learn, hopefully some fun information. But it's certainly one thing that bothers me is the focus on the term gender instead of sex. So I know in my practice, I'm very careful that I say, well, we're predicting the sex of the baby to be, instead of gender. So I'm sure that's something that you come across too. And I think, just want to say, you said that so beautifully, and I certainly am not an expert on CAH, but it's encouraging to hear that conversations can be had at a later time, and certainly medical issues need to be addressed early on. And another aspect that you were talking about earlier, is, the way that you were diagnosed was certainly an emergency setting. And so very different than what I hear from a lot of other people that have CAH or have kids with the condition. So genetic testing didn't really come up for you because you were diagnosed in terms of symptoms. But this is a conversation that you've had with your family in terms of like, if you should do genetic testing, and your sister recently had genetic testing. For those that don't know, CAH is considered an autosomal recessive disorder. So that means that for Sage's biological parents, I don't know if they're also the people that raised you, but for your biological parents, they're obligate carriers. So they're both a carrier of CAH. So certainly is appropriate that your sister ended up exploring genetic testing to see, is she also a carrier for the condition? Have you had more conversations with your sister or considered testing for yourself?
In regards to genetic testing, one, I didn't even know it existed until, my sister decided to become a genetic counselor and, explore this stuff in her own career path. But I'm interested in genetic testing. I don't want to have children, so, there's that insurance line of like, do I just tell them I want to have kids and get it anyway, and then try to navigate that? Or, do I press the issue of you shouldn't have to want to have kids to get the health care you need? This whole thing. Sometimes it's a thing about values for me, because I know I could just tell them, oh yeah, want to have a baby, but that's not true. I think that anyone with a genetic condition should absolutely get access to genetic testing. Especially if it's on rarediseases.org. Come on. Anyway, but yeah, the biggest thing I always think about though, like, yes, my dad had it and my mom, and I just wonder like who else had it and who else had it and who, all the way back. It always makes me wonder like how far back does it go and where does it come from in my family? Because it's there every generation, obviously. Otherwise, because if it's what did you call?
Autosomal recessive.
Autosomal recessive, it's been here for a long time. I don't think there would be any record of anyone else in my family having it because most babies probably died back, a century ago or more. So
an aspect of it, right?
So I always think about the ancestry part of it and how that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in genetic testing, but it's not like an urgent concern for me right now, being that my health is pretty well managed.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a good point, Sage, that it wouldn't affect anything in terms of health or treatment or medication. So it's more, in your case, would be like, oh, just interesting in confirmatory testing, I guess, at that point, and knowing exactly what genetic change in the gene that you have. Well, for both copies of the gene, I should say. And it's interesting that that we were born in the mid-90s. So back then, newborn screening didn't cover this condition. So babies that are now born with this condition, it is on newborn screening in the United States. So if, say you were born today, then it's quite possible that newborn screening would have been able to be the first to say, okay, this is coming up, like this baby could have CAH, and then later confirmatory testing. So it goes to show just how genetics have changed in the past 27 years, just as this, as a case example there. And you mentioned, your health is fairly stable right now, which is fantastic to hear. What types of treatments did you have over the years? Are you on any medications now to help alleviate any symptoms or prevent symptoms?
Yes. Yeah, I'm on quite a lot of meds. So besides the surgery I had as a child, I haven't had to have any other surgeries, which I'm grateful for. And I am also, really grateful that my body adapted well to the corticosteroids. Because there's this fine line between taking too many and causing issues and not taking enough and causing issues. I think if you take too many when you're young, you stunt your growth really, like you literally don't grow very tall and stuff. And if you take too little, then you have the other issue of, you are not supplementing the cortisol. So it's this fine little, game that these doctors have to play. And my body, it dialed in pretty quick and I was able to do that. And also just, having access to regular healthcare and all those things. But, long-term taking corticosteroids, even in small doses every day for my whole life, like they're not designed to be taken that way. I've actually done some research on it, and read, some different peer-reviewed studies and stuff of what it looks like for people who take them long term. And unfortunately, it's not that great. It's just not. Bone density is a really big thing. I had my first bone density scan when I was like 22 years old. I'm at really high risk for osteoporosis and stuff. Currently, I take prednisone, hydrocortisone, and fludrocortisone for the, directly for the CAH. And then I take a number of other medications to combat the symptoms of the corticosteroids. And without going into those medications, but it's like, weight gain. I'll have like hormonal acne. So it's not like, oh, I sweat. It's like I'm teenage acne forever. Fatigue, a lot of stress, fatigue. That's a lot. The list goes on, and then, you take those. It's just at a certain point, I've gotten to a point where I can't take more meds because they become, they counteract with each other. But I found a good spot with my meds, which I'm grateful for. So.
Yeah, no, it certainly sounds like a lot to keep track of. And as you're bringing up too, that just looking at long-term effects of certain medications that, really need to be on, but that it's like there is a side effect to a lot of different drugs. And especially then you start taking drugs to, combat those side effects. So it's certainly not as cut and dry as, oh, you have this disorder, take this pill and you're fine. It's more layered than that, from what I'm hearing from you. Are you seeking a position as a genetic assistant? People in these vital roles aid with clinical and research patient communication, data entry, genetic testing coordination, and administrative tasks. Therefore, training is key. We recommend the Genetic Assistant online training program at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. This online program provides knowledge and skills to learners considering genetic assistant positions or those recently hired into these roles who need job training. This program consists of 2 10-week instructor-led courses. All you need is a basic understanding of science, particularly biology. At the successful completion of the program, learners will receive a certificate of completion from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the McKusick-Nathans Department of Genetic Medicine. Applications are open for the spring cohort starting January 23rd, 2023. Applications for partial tuition waivers to help offset the cost of the program are due on December 23rd. Don't wait. Check out the Genetic Assistant online training program at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine now. Click the link in the show notes for this episode for more information. You can also access the link via the blog post for this episode, available at dnatoday.com. And one thing that I was looking at is just in general for genetic disorders, gene therapy has really been something since the 90s that has been something we're working towards. And we had some major issues in the 90s with really, really, tragic cases that set the field back in terms of gene therapy. But there is a resurgence and looking at how that can be helpful for people. So I learned you recently applied for enrollment in a gene therapy trial. And I'm sure if you end up doing that, you'll probably end up doing genetic testing, or that will be a prerequisite for it. Are there any hesitations if you do end up being accepted into the trial of actually participating? I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for them, but is there anything that you think of at first?
No, I didn't have any hesitations about it. I still don't. If anything, like hopefully they can find something that helps other people, but I don't know. I'm just not one to sit here and think, oh my gosh, what could go wrong? Like that is no way to approach something. No, that would be, it's like, not only do I think about how beneficial it would be, one, to not have some of these physical side effects or even just reduce some of them if it doesn't work all the way, but two, like the financial impact that all of these medications and these doctor's appointments and, I don't know what even the long term this looks like, that in and of itself makes it worth it. Like if I didn't have to refill all these meds and go to an endocrinologist and that would be really nice. So that in and of itself, yeah, I made it to the part, I'm still in contact with them. It's going to be like years worth because
Yeah.
it's like extensive where, you have to go be there for a week and a half and, whatever. But it sounds very non-intrusive. So I think that's why I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, and certainly clinical trials are really good about, educating you once you get to that point, hopefully, and, giving you all the information that is needed and making sure that that's something that you feel comfortable with at the time. But it's for people that are open to it, like yourself. I mean, that's just fantastic because it really not only helps people in the CAH community, but also those, with other rare diseases and just learning more about gene therapy. As we're approaching the end of the episode, I also wanted to circle back to what we were talking about a little bit before in terms of, the intersex community and CAH, being within that community. A lot of people that have CAH identify with a gender that may be different from what they were assigned as at birth. And I know for you, as you mentioned before we even connected when we were emailing, you told me that you're non-binary. And that, I was doing a little bit of research myself that it's quite common for people that have CAH to identify with the LGBTQIA plus community. Can you share a little bit about your own experience in terms of how your gender identity has changed throughout your life and how you've, processed this over time?
I mean, the reality is that I was fortunate enough to, have parents that even though, I was, they didn't, my parents were never told the word intersex. And the whole time I was even up till I was like 17, still going to a pediatrician. That word never was said. We knew that there was this, condition, disorder, whatever you want to call it, could have effects on hormonal things, but there was never any talk of queerness, and not because my parents were weird about it. It just wasn't talked about. But when I was really young, I had a nervous breakdown. I'm talking like 3 or 4 because I couldn't pee standing up like my dad. So there were things like that maybe other people didn't have. But all the way to, then I swung the pendulum, like I was what you would call a tomboy, really, really hardcore when I was through elementary and stuff. And then when puberty hit, I tried to assimilate to femininity, the cult of femininity, as I call it. And it feels like I've, I spent enough time trying to fit that mold, that for me, it's not that it didn't feel right. It just wasn't me. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. And people think, a lot of folks who maybe don't have these questions about gender identity, sometimes think that it's this like, burning bush moment where I'm queer. And some people it is, but I don't think most of us experience that. I mean, it's a ever continuously growing. I mean, I have to Google it all the time. What does this mean? Like, if I have to Google it, y'all should too. Okay. But, there's a lot of letters because everyone can be involved. But I just started realizing that, like, I didn't want to, it was less about boy or girl, or, it was more about, like, I'm just not, because it fell a lot into, I'm not hyper feminine. I feel very I'm asexual, so I don't experience like sexual attraction or romantic attraction to people. And that could be very well because of all the meds I'm on, but I don't really care. I just don't. And as a result of that, like, the cult of femininity did not suit me well. I don't know how it's like getting all cute and trying to, the male gaze and all this stuff. It was very painful and it took a long time. I've never really been asked this question, so I apologize if I'm kind of all over the place. Well, I mean, I found a lot of solace when I did my internship at the LGBTQ Resource Center at the University of Utah, and all of my coworkers were trans people. And I found a lot of community with, trans and queer folks. Not necessarily, I mean, you can slap any word you want on for me. It doesn't matter. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter to other people. But, queer, non-binary, genderqueer, trans, because at the end of the day, like, I mean, that's my community. Those are my people. That's, and what it is for me is that because I was never able to find community with other people with CAH, I found the community where I was affirmed and, told that my experience meant something, and that like all these things, I found that just in the LGBTQ community in general, mainly, like I said, with, trans women and, queer people of color and the folks who could find all these intersections that I was talking about of like medical and socioeconomic and gender and just all this stuff. Because it's not just like, hi, I'm gay. There's a lot more unpacking. But I would say that, I'm not, I am intersex. One, I don't mind the term, and two, like in a medical definition, whatever, but I don't like to think of myself as like, that's all I am, I'm not all of anything. Yeah, I don't know, my gender changes a lot, but ultimately it's very, for lack of a better word, it's androgynous. It's very ambiguous. It's ambiguous, like intersex genitalia.
I think that brings us a full circle. And I mean, that really resonates with me. I think, as you said at one point, it's like not like, I didn't have a moment where I was like, light bulb went off, like, oh, I'm not straight, I'm queer. So it is kind of a progression, just like personal development. Like to me, like that, I'm never going to finish being the person that I want to be and I aspire to be. And it's kind of the same that, I think we're on the same page in terms of like, queerness and everything of like, I'm never going to get to a point to be like, this is exactly who I am. Like maybe I will, but I don't think so. As you said, I think a lot of people experience at least somewhat fluidity in terms of who they are and learning about themselves. And I think it's just such a beautiful answer that you had, because it's your own life and the way that you found connection with other people. It doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, it's this group of people that also have CAH. It's like, that's one aspect. Maybe that's part of your identity. Maybe it's not. But that there's so many aspects to us as humans, and that when we can find a community that connects with at least a part of that, there can be so much, affirmation there. And I think that's just such a beautiful answer to that. And I think just such a perfect way to end an episode. And I just really want to thank you so much for being so open. As you said at the beginning, you're like, I'm an open book. And I always, really do my best to make sure that people feel comfortable on the show. And we're only covering what they are good with. And you're like, let's just talk about everything. So I just want to say thank you for that. And I'm sure there are people listening that, either have CAH or they're in the intersex community, or, definitely resonated with something you said today, because I certainly did. So thank you so much for just sharing so much of just your own, personal life on here in such a public format. So thank you so much, Sage.
Yeah, of course. No, I appreciate it. Yeah, this could be unpacked for a long time. So I appreciate us touching on some of these points, and thanks for having me on the show.
We could do a whole podcast series just about sex and gender. So yeah, definitely.
But yes, we could do an entire podcast about this. But no, I really appreciate you having me on the show, and hopefully we talk again soon.
For more information about today's episode, visit dnapodcast.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. We encourage your questions, comments, guest pitches, and ideas. Send them all into info@dnapodcast.com. Search DNA Today on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, so you can connect with us there. And a favor, please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allow more genetic nerds like yourself to find the show. DNA Today is hosted and produced by myself, Keir Deneen. Our social media lead is Corinne Merlino. Our video lead is Amanda Andrioli. Thanks for listening, and join us next time to discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA.